All of this is public knowledge. So if we're going to apologize and I'm going to take it seriously, I would have liked to see something like, hey, in the note, we apologize or I apologize for knocking over the picture in the room, or more specificity. I knocked over the photo of your father. Okay, that would be, okay, we need to take this seriously. Something that's not released to the public. Then, yeah, there might be something to this. But
From the very beginning, something about this case didn't behave the way it was supposed to. A woman disappeared. There was evidence of a violent event at her home, and then, almost immediately, a ransom demand surfaced. To the public, the story seemed clear. A kidnapping for money, a life held in exchange for millions, a clock ticking somewhere in the background. But to the people who have spent their careers studying how these crimes actually work, the details told a very different story. Because in a real kidnapping for ransom, every move has a purpose. Every message is calculated. Every second is used to increase pressure and move toward a single outcome: payment. And from the very first communication in this case, that structure wasn't there. It wasn't just unusual, it was fundamentally broken. And if you pay attention to true crime cases like this and want deeper, fact-based breakdowns without speculation, take a moment to like this video and subscribe to True Crime Dre. Because what unfolds here isn't just a disappearance. It's a case where the narrative the public believed may never have been real to begin with. Nancy Guthrie was taken from her home in a way that left no doubt something serious had happened. There were signs of a struggle. There was physical evidence indicating she had not left voluntarily. And there were data points, including device-related information, that suggested a sudden and critical event. From the outside, everything pointed toward a forced abduction. That part of the story has never been seriously disputed. What changed everything was what came next: a ransom message. And a demand for millions of dollars. Deadlines. Instructions. All the elements people have come to associate with hostage situations. The kind of message that immediately reshapes how a case is understood. Because once ransom enters the picture, the assumption becomes simple. The victim is alive, and someone is trying to turn that life into money. That assumption drove the early days of this case. The family responded publicly, expressing willingness to comply. They made it clear they would do whatever it took. They asked for communication. They asked for proof. They asked for a way to bring her home. At the same time, the story spread quickly. Media coverage intensified. Experts began discussing negotiation strategies. Viewers followed updates as if they were watching a situation that could still be resolved. But behind that public narrative, something else was happening. People with direct experience in hostage negotiations began analyzing the details. And almost immediately, they noticed patterns that didn't match. One of those voices came from someone who had handled hundreds of real-world kidnapping cases in high-risk environments. Dan O'Shea, a former Navy SEAL and coordinator of hostage response operations during the Iraq War, had spent years dealing with situations where lives depended on correctly interpreting communication from kidnappers. His experience wasn't theoretical, it was operational. He had seen how ransom demands are structured, how kidnappers establish control, how they maintain leverage, and how they ultimately try to secure payment. When he looked at the communications in this case, his conclusion was direct. And this did not look like a kidnapping for ransom. That assessment didn't come weeks later. It came within the first few days, and it was based on specific, observable details. The first issue was where the message was sent. In legitimate ransom cases, communication is almost always private. The reason is simple. The family is the one expected to pay. The entire process depends on maintaining a controlled channel between the people holding the victim and the people with the money. That channel allows for negotiation. It allows for verification. And, most importantly, it limits law enforcement involvement for as long as possible. But in this case, the ransom message didn't go to the family first. It went to the media. That decision alone changed the entire structure of the situation. Because once a message becomes public, everything shifts. Law enforcement is immediately involved at full scale. The family is no longer isolated, the communication is no longer controlled, and the chances of quietly collecting money drop significantly. For anyone whose goal is financial gain, those are not conditions you would intentionally create. At the same time, the family learned about the demand the same way the public did, through news coverage. That meant there was no direct line of communication, no private exchange, no way to confirm that messages were being received, and no way to negotiate in real time. This leads to the second critical issue. There was no functional communication channel, no phone number, no email, no secure system for back-and-forth contact. In a real ransom scenario, that kind of channel is essential. Without it, the entire process collapses. Because negotiation requires interaction. Questions need answers, instructions need confirmation, and both sides need to know the other is actively participating. In this case, none of that existed. The only responses the family could make were public, statements, videos, appeals directed into the open, with no guarantee that whoever sent the original message was even watching. That transforms what should be a negotiation into something else entirely. A one-way broadcast. And that is not how ransom collection works. The third issue was even more critical. There was no proof of life. In any legitimate kidnapping for ransom, proof of life is not optional. It is the foundation of the entire exchange. Because without it, there is no reason to believe the victim is alive. And without that belief, there is no reason to pay. Proof of life usually takes a very specific form. It might be a recorded message, a photo with identifiable details, or answers to personal questions only the victim could provide. Something that confirms, beyond doubt, that the person is alive and in the custody of the people making the demand. In this case, that never happened. Not once. No verified evidence was provided showing that Nancy Guthrie was alive after the abduction. And that absence didn't go unnoticed. Multiple former law enforcement officials and negotiation experts pointed to it as a major red flag. Because from a financial perspective, providing proof of life is the easiest way to move the process forward. It builds credibility, it increases pressure, and it makes payment more likely. And not providing, it does the opposite. It creates doubt, it stalls progress, and it undermines the entire premise of the demand. At the same time, the details included in the messages didn't resolve that doubt. Some of the information referenced things that were already known publicly. Others could have been observed by someone familiar with the property. None of it required having the victim in custody at that moment. That distinction matters, because it means the messages did not contain anything that definitively proved control over a living hostage. As the days passed, the situation became even more unusual. Deadlines were introduced, specific times by which payment was expected. Deadlines are a common tactic in ransom cases. They create urgency, they force decisions, and they increase emotional pressure on the family. But in real cases, deadlines are rarely final. If a deadline passes without payment, communication continues. Sometimes pressure increases, sometimes new deadlines are set. But the interaction doesn't simply stop. Because as long as the victim is alive, there is still value. There is still leverage. There is still a reason to keep trying. In this case, the deadlines passed, and nothing happened. No escalation, no renewed contact, no consequences, just silence. That silence was significant, because it suggested that the leverage, if it ever existed, was no longer being used. And that raises a difficult question. If this was truly about money, why stop? Why walk away from a potential multi-million-dollar payment without making any further attempt to secure it? That question became even more important when investigators looked at the financial side of the demand. The ransom message included a Bitcoin wallet, a destination for the payment, a place where the money was supposed to go. But when that wallet was monitored, it showed no activity, no deposits, no transactions, no movement at all. The account remained empty, which means no money was ever even attempted to be collected through that channel. That detail alone contradicts the core purpose of a ransom demand. Because if the goal is financial gain, the system for receiving money has to function. And in this case, it didn't. As more time passed, the investigation began to shift, quietly at first, then more clearly. Attention moved away from the ransom messages and toward physical evidence, forensic analysis, DNA, not local leads, the kind of work associated with identifying a suspect, not negotiating with a group. That shift didn't happen randomly. It reflected what investigators were seeing and what they were no longer seeing. No ongoing communication, no evolving demands, no indication that a structured ransom operation was in progress. Instead, the focus turned to the scene itself, to what happened inside the home, to who had access, to who might have known details about the property, and to evidence that suggested the person responsible was not part of a distant network, but someone connected to the immediate area. At the same time, another layer of complexity emerged. Authorities confirmed that at least one individual, unrelated to the original crime, had sent fraudulent ransom messages to the family, on someone attempting to exploit the situation, to take advantage of uncertainty and fear. That revelation introduced a new possibility, that not all communications connected to the case came from the same source, which makes the situation even more difficult to interpret, because it means some messages may have had no connection to the abduction at all. And separating real signals from noise becomes part of the investigation. As these elements came together, a different interpretation began to take shape. One that didn't rely on the assumption of an ongoing ransom scenario, but instead looked at the possibility that the crime had a different motive from the start, or that something had changed very early on. Investigators have stated publicly that they believe the incident was targeted, not random, not opportunistic, but directed at a specific individual. That detail narrows the scope significantly, because targeted crimes usually involve some level of prior knowledge, familiarity, access, and intent. It also aligns with the physical evidence suggesting the person responsible had some understanding of the home and its layout. At this point in the case, the focus is no longer on tracking money. It is on identifying a person, a suspect whose presence can be tied to the scene, whose movements can be reconstructed, and whose actions can be explained through evidence. And that represents a complete shift from where the story began, because what started as a widely followed ransom case has evolved into something else, something more grounded in forensic investigation than negotiation. If you've followed this case this far, I'd take a moment to like the video and subscribe to True Crime Dre, because in the next part, we're going to break down the most critical turning point in this investigation and the theory that experts say explains why the ransom narrative never worked. As the days turned into weeks, the structure of the case began to shift in a way that only becomes visible when you stop looking at what was said and start focusing on what never happened. Because in a real kidnapping for ransom, time does not move quietly. It tightens, it escalates, it forces interaction. But here, time passed without pressure, without movement, without any of the behaviors that define a functioning ransom operation. And that absence became the most important piece of evidence. By this stage, multiple professionals with backgrounds in hostage negotiation and federal investigations had begun outlining a framework that helps explain why the case felt so fundamentally different, not based on speculation, but based on patterns observed across real-world cases. The framework is simple. There are generally two categories of crimes that involve taking a person and making demands. The first is financially motivated, the second is not. And understanding the difference between those two categories changes everything about how a case is interpreted. In a financially motivated kidnapping, every decision revolves around one outcome: getting paid. The victim is treated as an asset. Alive, they have value. That value is preserved through careful handling, controlled communication, and calculated pressure. And the people responsible avoid unnecessary exposure. They limit contact to the family. They create a private negotiation environment. And they provide proof of life early because it increases the likelihood of payment. Every step is deliberate. Every action moves toward a transaction. In contrast, there is another category of cases where the goal is not financial gain. In those situations, the behavior looks completely different. Communication becomes public. Messages are sent in ways that maximize attention. Deadlines are used to generate headlines rather than facilitate negotiation. And the process does not move toward resolution. It sustains uncertainty. It keeps the story active. Because the objective is not to complete an exchange, it is to create impact. When experts began applying that framework to this case, the alignment became difficult to ignore. The communication patterns matched the second category, not the first. The messages were public. The channel was broken. The deadlines were performative. And the absence of proof of life removed the foundation required for any financial transaction. That doesn't mean the original crime was staged. It means the ransom narrative may not reflect the actual motive. And that distinction is critical, because it suggests that what people were watching unfold was not an active negotiation, but something layered on top of an already completed event. As investigators continued their work, the focus remained on verifiable evidence. Inside the home, forensic analysis identified DNA that did not belong to Nancy Guthrie or anyone with authorized access to the property. With that detail shifted attention toward identifying a specific individual, someone who had been physically present, someone whose genetic profile could be traced, and someone whose connection to the location could be established. This is where the investigation began moving in a direction that had nothing to do with ransom demands. Genetic genealogy became part of the process, a method used in cases where unidentified DNA is compared against databases to find familial connections. It is a technique that has been used to solve cases where traditional leads have failed, and its use here indicates a focus on identifying a suspect through biological evidence. At the same time, investigators began narrowing their attention to the immediate area. The evidence suggested familiarity, knowledge of access points, and an understanding of how to move through the property without drawing attention. Those details are not consistent with a distant, organized group attempting to carry out a complex financial crime. They are consistent with someone local, someone who had been there before, someone who knew exactly where to go. Public appeals reflected that shift. Instead of focusing on ransom instructions or financial transactions, law enforcement began asking for information about individuals who may have been seen near the property, people connected to nearby work sites, individuals who may have had legitimate reasons to be in the area prior to the incident. This is a different kind of investigation. It is grounded in identification, in narrowing possibilities, in building a case around a person, not a network. And that transition speaks to what investigators believe is most likely. Because if there were credible evidence of an ongoing ransom operation, resources would still be directed toward maintaining that line of inquiry. Instead, the emphasis moved entirely toward solving a targeted crime. At the same time, the earlier communications began to look less like instructions and more like fragments, messages that did not connect into a coherent system. Messages that did not build on each other. Messages that did not lead anywhere. That lack of continuity is important, because in real ransom cases, communication evolves. It adapts. It responds to actions taken by the family and law enforcement. Here, there was no evolution, just isolated events. And then, silence. That silence has now lasted far longer than any functional ransom scenario would allow. Because the longer communication stops, the less credible the original demand becomes, and the less likely it is that money was ever the objective. By this point, another key detail had emerged through public reporting. Some of the messages received during the investigation were confirmed to be fraudulent, sent by individuals attempting to take advantage of the situation, people who had no connection to the crime itself. That introduces a layer of distortion, because it means the information environment surrounding the case was not controlled. It was contaminated. And that makes it harder to determine which elements, if any, originated from the person responsible. But it also reinforces a broader point. When a case becomes highly visible, and it attracts opportunistic behavior, and that behavior can mimic the structure of legitimate communication without having any real connection to the underlying event. Which brings the focus back to what can actually be verified: the physical evidence, the timeline, the absence of proof of life, and the lack of a functional ransom process. When those elements are viewed together, they support a different interpretation of what may have happened. One that does not depend on the assumption that the victim was being held for money. Instead, investigators have indicated that they believe the incident was targeted, that it was directed at Nancy Guthrie specifically, and that it was not random. That conclusion is based on evidence, not theory. Targeted crimes often involve prior observation, knowledge of routines, an awareness of vulnerabilities, and a degree of planning that reflects intent toward a specific individual. That does not automatically explain motive, but it does narrow the scope of possibilities, because it suggests the person responsible had a reason to focus on that location and that individual. At the same time, some experts have discussed a scenario that aligns with the available evidence while remaining grounded in known investigative patterns. A situation where an abduction occurs, but the outcome does not follow the original plan, where something goes wrong early, where the conditions required to sustain a victim are not met, and where the situation deteriorates before any structured demand can be carried out. In those cases, the behavior that follows can become inconsistent, because the original objective is no longer achievable, and the actions taken afterward may not reflect a clear strategy. That framework does not rely on speculation. It reflects cases where events deviate from intent, where control is lost, and where subsequent behavior becomes reactive rather than planned. In the context of this case, it provides one possible explanation for why the ransom elements never aligned with real-world patterns, why communication lacked structure, why proof of life was never provided, and why the process never moved toward an exchange. But what remains constant, regardless of interpretation, is the evidence. There was a forced event at the home. There is unidentified DNA connected to the scene, and there is an ongoing effort to identify the person responsible. But everything else exists around those facts, and must be evaluated in relation to them. As the investigation continues, the focus remains on building a case that can be supported in court, which means relying on evidence that can be verified, tested, and presented. Not assumptions, not narratives, and not interpretations that cannot be substantiated. That is why the direction of the case matters, because it shows what investigators believe is most likely based on what they have found, and what they have not found. No proof of life, no functional negotiation, no financial transaction, and no continuation of communication after the initial messages. Those absences are not minor details. They are defining characteristics. They shape the entire understanding of the case, and they explain why the investigation has moved away from ransom and toward identification. At this point, the central question is no longer how to negotiate. It is who was responsible, and how they carried out the act. Because once that is established, everything else can be understood in context. The messages, the timeline, the decisions made afterward, all of it becomes clearer when anchored to a known individual. Until then, the case remains open, driven by evidence, guided by analysis, and shaped by the recognition that what appeared to be a ransom case may never have functioned as one. If you're following this breakdown and want to see how all of these pieces connect to the most critical developments in the investigation, take a moment to like the video and subscribe to True Crime Dre.